Hey guys, tonight we're diving straight into the fire and frost of Norse mythology, the kind of tale that was never meant to be gentle. This isn't just another bedtime story, it's the saga of the very end, when even the gods themselves had to face the same fear that keeps us awake at night, the fear that nothing lasts forever. Picture this, the sky hanging low, the wind slicing colder than bone, and every fire guttering out one by one. In the old stories, that's how it began, the first shiver of the long winter, the whisper of a fate no one could undo. Not Odin with his one good eye, not Thor with his hammer, not even Loki with his endless tricks. Every thread spun by the Norns was leading to this moment, to Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. And here's the part that cuts deeper than any axe. The people who told these stories weren't just talking about far-off worlds of giants and wolves. They were talking about their own lives, their own fear of endless winters, of hunger, of watching everything they'd built turn to ash. It was their way of saying even the mighty fall, but out of ruin something still survives. That's why this isn't just history, it's a mirror, a warning, and maybe, for those of us listening tonight, a strange kind of comfort. Because if gods can shiver in the dark, then maybe our own sleepless nights aren't so small after all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cold deepened, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. Out of that silence, the Norns sat in their shadowed hall, their hands never still, three sisters, older than time, drawing their threads from the roots of the world tree itself, who remembered what was, Verdandi, who wove what is, and Skuld, who whispered what would be. Their loom was not wood or iron, but the twisting veins of Yggdrasil, the great ash whose branches stretched across every realm. Each thread gleamed for a life, a god, a man, or a beast, and none could escape their weaving. Even Odin, who had torn out his own eye for wisdom, could only watch as they wove the pattern that ended with his death. The Norns did not smile, nor mourn. They worked with the patience of frost. To them, even gods were brief sparks, flaring and gone. Every drop of dew on Yggdrasil's leaves was a story, every drop of sap its lifeblood, and the Norns saw the sap blacken. They saw the dew freeze before it could fall. They saw wolves running across the sky, far away. Odin felt that chill in his bones. It was not the cold of the northern winds he had weathered those. This was the weight of knowing the story was already written. He walked through Asgard's shining halls, past warriors laughing in Valhalla, and he felt the hollowness beneath their joy. They drank and feasted. But every horn of mead was only a pause before the call to the last battle. He climbed the highest tower and gazed out toward Jotunheim, the land of giants. In the distance, storm clouds rolled like mountains. The old enemies were stirring. He clenched his spear, Gungnir, and felt how light it was in his hand. What good is steel against prophecy? The Norns had whispered his doom. He would be swallowed by a wolf his own sons had tried and failed to tame. Odin's one eye closed, and behind the lid he saw flashes of what lay ahead, his sons in combat. His ravens circling above a sky on fire, his people crying out in terror. He had searched for a way out of this fate, but the threads always led back to the same place, the jaws of Fenrir. Still, he refused to surrender. If he could not change the ending, he would fight to shape the meaning of it. Beneath Yggdrasil's roots, in the halls of hell, the dead shifted in their endless night. They had begun to murmur, to stir as if something were calling them. The goddess Hel, pale on one side, dark on the other, listened. She felt the tremor that signalled her brothers would soon rise, Fenrir snapping his chains, Jormungandr uncoiling from the sea. She said nothing, only turned her face toward the silence above and smiled faintly at the thought of balance restored. And still, the Norns wove. The air thickened, the world darkened, and every creature, mortal and divine, felt the pull of the loom. The sound was faint, like wind through dry leaves, but it reached everywhere. No one slept easily, even in their dreams. They heard the soft scrape of fate being measured, cut, and tied. It was the beginning of the end, and yet the story had only just begun. The loom creaked as if the wood of the world itself strained against the threads. Urd's hand moved slow and steady, pulling fibres that glowed with the weight of what had already been. She spoke little, but her eyes carried centuries. Every battle fought, every oath sworn, every betrayal whispered, she tied them into her section of the weave with quiet certainty. Verdandi worked beside her, her lips moving as though reciting a prayer no one else could hear. Her task was not to recall but to lay down the present, every heartbeat from the smallest sparrow to the greatest god. Schooled, youngest and sharpest, held the shears. She measured each line with merciless precision, and when she cut, it was final. Together they were not cruel, nor kind. They were inevitability given form. Tonight, the threads ran dark. The pattern they shaped showed no summer, no harvest, no joy. Instead, they spun cold winds and endless nights. The line that had once blazed for Balder was gone, snipped with a sound that still echoed through the cosmos. Odin's line burned bright, but its end glowed hot, as though it would be devoured by fire and teeth. Thor's shimmered thick and heavy, the cord vibrating with each strike of his hammer, but its edge frayed with poison. The gods would fight, but each thread showed loss. The Norns did not look at one another. They did not need to. The truth was there in their weaving. Odin returned to the base of Yggdrasil, his boots heavy with dread. He had given his eye for wisdom, but wisdom without escape was a curse. He looked down into Mimir's well, the black water rippling as if it already knew his questions. The reflection showed him not his face, but a wolf's jaws opening wide. He turned away, heart clenched. He thought of his sons, of Thor's laughter echoing like thunder across the halls, of Baldur's light already extinguished, of Vidar's silence that masked an iron will. He wondered which of them would carry his name after the fire, and which would be dust scattered in the wind. Far above, ravens Hugin and Munin circled the sky. Their wings beat against the cold air, and every feather carried thought and memory back to their master. They whispered of men at war, of wolves growing bold at the edges of villages, of seas rising with venom. They whispered that the world no longer obeyed the god's hand. Odin listened, his jaw tightening. He had built Asgard into a fortress of light, but the walls were already trembling. The warriors of Valhalla sharpened their blades, boasting of glory to come, but Odin heard only the hollow laughter of men who dreamed of dying well, not of living longer. He went to Frigg, and her eyes brimmed with grief that never seemed to fade. She had begged every stone, every flame, every beast to swear not to harm Balder. She had overlooked only a sliver of mistletoe, and it had been enough. Her voice shook as she said, "I thought I could save him. I thought love was stronger than fate." Odin placed a hand on her shoulder, but he had no comfort left to give. He knew what the Norns had woven could not be undone. Love did not bind threads. Only the loom did. Thor stormed into the hall then, thunder in his step. His face was fierce, red with rage. "Let the giants come!" He spat. "Let the serpent rise. I'll smash their skulls until the seas run dry." His bravado rattled the air, but even he paused when he saw the weight in his father's gaze. Odin did not rebuke him. He only nodded, because sometimes fury was the only shield left against despair. Yet deep inside, he mourned, because he had seen Thor's cord unravel with venom and collapse after 9 heavy steps. The Norns' weaving grew faster. Sparks flew from their loom, and each spark was a life snuffed out in the vision of what would come. The sisters' hands blurred, yet each gesture was deliberate. They were closing in on the edge of the tapestry. Skuld's shears glinted like frost, and Odin felt them even from afar. He had fought countless battles, won and lost, but nothing chilled him more than the quiet snip that awaited at the end of his line. Still, he resolved to walk toward it. He clenched Gungnir in his fist and swore, "If fate writes my end, then let me write the path to it." His voice carried through the halls of Asgard, through Midgard's villages, and into the ears of every creature that would one day stand at the plain of Vigrid. He did not beg the Norns for mercy. He did not ask for more time. He only demanded that when the wolf's jaws closed, the world would remember he had not knelt. The loom stilled for a moment, the sisters' hands pausing, not to grant him grace, but to acknowledge that even a god could rage with dignity against the inevitable. The thread continued, but Odin's vow remained in the fabric, bright as lightning across the storm. The vow lingered like a heat-lightning scar across the sky. And then the world seemed to inhale. Somewhere beyond the walls and banners, a door swung open to the winter night, and the cold breathed in like a guest who didn't bother to knock. People in Midgard felt it first, not in the way of prophecy or omens, but in the way bread failed to rise and lambs were born too early, in the way fathers stared at the horizon and miscounted the days because the sun began to keep strange hours. The wind changed its voice. It didn't whistle anymore, it scraped, the way a whetstone drags along an old blade, patient and rough. Farmers laid a hand on the earth the way you might lay a hand on a fevered brow. The ground kept its warmth, yes, but it did not promise anything. In halls where no books were kept and in cities where there were too many, people told each other endings, not just one kind. Some spoke in the language of trumpets and angels, where fire reigned and judgment split the good from the wicked, a world remade by a hand that was not tired of it. Others spoke of cycles that turn like a wheel you could time by stars, the ages that begin in gold and dwindle to iron, or the yugas that stretch and shrink like breaths until the cosmos exhales. The Norse did not argue with any of this. They nodded, poured a drink, and answered with a story that smelled of smoke and brine and the clean ache of snow, not a courtroom at the end of time, not a gentle return to the start, but a fight in the open, where even the bravest would fall and still call it a good day. In that spirit, children slept with knives near the door, not because knives could stop fate, but because a hand on a handle steadied the heart. Mothers mended cloaks with thread pulled tight, whispering charms that tasted of salt and soot. Old men took their seats by the hearth, the way captains take their posts on storm-bitten decks. If the last thing you do is keep the flame fed, then that is the last thing you do. The stories that had once been decoration hardened into instructions. If the sky darkens, count your people. If the wolves' song sounds closer tonight than it did last night, bring the animals inside. If a stranger asks for a bed, give them one even if you hate the snow they walked in on. Hospitality was not sweetness. It was a shield. Above them all hung the tree, though most would never see its trunk except in dreams or in the way a certain wind wove through a certain stand of birches. Yggdrasil's branches ran like roads of thought, its roots tunneled through memory, lore, and loss. Sap travelled the tree's length the way news runs through a village slowly, and then, all at once, when the Norns trimmed a thread, the tree shuddered so slightly that only those listening for it felt the tremor. When they let the shears rest, there was a hush that emptied rooms, on a morning that never quite became day. 3 roosters answered that hush, one gold-throated atop the halls of the gods, one sooty-voiced among the giants, one pale as a candle stub deep in hell. Their cries did not overlap, they rhymed. The first to take meaning from that rhyme were the ones used to taking meaning from small things. Women hauling water through ice fog, smiths listening to the tone of red metal, scouts who could tell from the lay of ash which way last night's wind had blown. They said the roosters were not warning so much as counting, one for the halls that would burn, one for the mountains that would walk, one for the dead who had decided finally that the world owed them a march under grey banners. No one panicked. Panic was a luxury of softer climates. Instead, they inventoried blankets and bones and virtues. You keep generosity because it keeps you. You keep courage because fear makes poor bread. You keep stories because the night eats names before it eats anything else. Odin rode then, not to command, but to learn. He took the roads that felt like pages, and he read what lay on them. The ravens kept time above him like the hands of a dark clock. In a fishing village, he watched men go out on black water because hunger kills slower than waves. In a hall with sagging beams, he watched a girl swear she'd marry only a man who could build a hearth that did not smoke an oath the size of a life. He stopped in a field where the frost had pinched the earth into hard questions, and let his hand hover over the soil without touching it, as if it were a wound that would turn if you pressed. Everywhere, the same truth endings had begun to collect like driftwood, and people were building with them. Not all endings were loud. Some sat in corners like tired dogs and waited to be noticed. In Jotunheim, clouds knelt on the mountain shoulders and stayed there, heavy as regrets. The giants counted their long grudges, names like stones they turned over in their hands. They did not practice speeches. They sharpened sled runners and dug out old iron from snow-buried forges. Far out at sea, something vast rolled in its sleep and tasted the water to see if it had changed. It had. Venom sweetened it. Above hell, the air hung with the smell of iron keys. There is a scent to gates that have not opened in a long time and suddenly remember how. Some nights, fire refused to behave as a friend. It tunneled into fuel without giving much light, the way grief eats and does not warm. Other nights, it leaped too eagerly, as if it understood there might not be many chances left to be ablaze. People talked to it not with prayers so much as with honest accounting. Here is what we have. Here is what we need. Here is the music we can still make if you keep your end of the bargain. And the fire, like most decent partners, met them halfway. The gods felt all this from their bright distance, and distance didn't help. Thor tried to cheer the halls with noise, but thunder belongs to the outside. It simply reminded everyone that storms were the gods' oldest language. Frigg gathered linens no blade could cut, no stain could keep, and yet she folded them with the care of someone who knows that clean cloth is a kind of courage. Tyr's hand, well, what was left of it ached deep when the air pressure changed. He smiled at no one in particular, the way soldiers do when a familiar pain returns on schedule. Heimdall leaned into thresholds and listened. You could have mistaken him for a statue if not for the way statues don't breathe through their teeth when they're thinking too hard. There were still jokes. There will always be jokes. An old woman told a boy that if a wolf swallows the sun, he should put out a bowl and see if any light drips out the sides. "I'd drink that," he said, practical as bread. In a longhouse where the roofline sagged like tired shoulders, a weaver decided to stitch a story of the sea serpent onto a cloak, circle after circle of blue thread around the throat. "If the world has to end," she said, "I want the seam between now and later to be neat." The cloak would outlast her. Someone would find it scorched and still beautiful, and that is as good a wish as any. Comparisons crept in, as they always do, when people measure their fears against other people's. The storytellers talked of reckonings with scales and books, of worlds that close their eyes only to open them on morning without shadow. The Norse nodded again and said, "Fine, but ours is not a judge's chamber or a spinning wheel. Ours is a field you can walk to. You can dig your heel into its dirt. You can hear armor on the wind before you see the horizon. And when the first line of spear points appears like frost along the top of the world, you don't negotiate with them. You set your feet. If there is mercy, it lies in the fact that you will not be asked to pretend the day is something other than what it is. That kind of clarity makes people gentle with one another in strange ways. A stranger came late to a farm where the fence leaned like an old man, and the family gave him a bowl and a place by the fire without questions sharper than "Can you carry wood?" In town, a brawl started and stopped because someone began to sing a work song out of season, and everyone realized at once they still knew the words. Even in Asgard, where pride is a second skin, someone no one ever agreed who left a cup of mead on a windowsill for the night itself, a little sweetness to go with whatever it had to do. And then, like a door settling into its frame after a long shift in the house, the sky clicked, not loud, final. The roosters answered a second time, each to each, and the wind that had been scraping at every edge in the world smoothed its palm and laid it flat, as if to say enough. No one shouted. They adjusted their cloaks. They counted again. They lifted their faces without closing their eyes, because if you turn away from the first sign, you'll miss the second, and you don't get many chances to notice your place in a story while you're still standing in it. Somewhere among all of that, a white hall held its breath. A sprig of something green and innocent rested where no one had thought to look for danger, because who looks for a blade inside a blessing? In the weave the Norns kept. A bright thread that had once run like summer across the whole cloth narrowed to something slender as a sigh. The sisters did not pause. The world does not. But even they, it is said, allowed themselves the smallest glance toward the line that would soon be tested by the smallest thing. The hall of the gods was filled with light that wasn't sunlight. Fires burned in iron bowls. Torches snapped and hissed, but no warmth reached the heart. The air was heavy with unease, and silence stretched so taut it seemed it might tear. In the centre stood Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, radiant in a way no torch could imitate. His very skin seemed to glow. His laughter cut sharper than steel, yet softened everything it touched. To the Aesir, he was proof that even in a world born of ice and fire, beauty could still exist, and beauty, they thought, could not be broken. But Baldur's dreams told him otherwise. Night after night, visions crowded his sleep shadows, devouring him, flames licking his body, spears piercing his side. He woke drenched in cold sweat, trembling though no frost lay in the hall. When he confessed these dreams, a hush fell over Asgard. Even the bravest gods looked away. Everyone knew that dreams were not just dreams. They were messengers. Frigg, desperate, swore she would not lose her son to fate. She set out across the 9 realms, visiting stone and flame, tree and beast, wind and water. To each she begged a promise, "Do not harm my child," and each agreed. Steel dulled itself, sickness turned aside, fire dimmed its hunger, and poison hushed its bite. She returned with triumph, believing she had built a wall higher than any god's spear. In the golden courtyard, Baldur stood while his brothers and companions tested the vow. They hurled spears that bent away like reeds, stones that bounced off with harmless thuds, blades that glanced without leaving so much as a scratch. Laughter rolled across the field. They treated it as sport proof that Baldur was untouchable, a living fortress. The clamour of their amusement masked the quiet dread beneath. Every weapon shattered only seemed to sharpen the edge of destiny waiting unseen. Loki lingered at the edge of the circle, his smile thin, his eyes restless. To him, perfection was an insult. It mocked everything crooked and flawed in the world, mocked him most of all. The laughter grated like salt rubbed into an old wound. He slipped away, his mind turning like a whetstone. He found it in a forgotten corner of the forest, a sprig of mistletoe, pale and unremarkable, climbing up the bark of a tree. Frigg, in her haste, had overlooked it, dismissing it as too young, too harmless to be sworn. Loki plucked it with careful fingers, whittled it into a dart small enough to hide, sharp enough to pierce. He felt no triumph, only a cold clarity. Fate did not need cruelty. It needed only a hand willing to carry it forward. Baldur's blind brother Hoder stood apart from the revelry, his face shadowed with frustration at his own uselessness. He could not see the joy on their faces, could not join their cruel game of throwing weapons that never landed true. Loki approached with the softness of honey. He placed the dart in Hoder's palm, whispered, "Why should you be left out? Aim your throw, and I will guide your hand. Join your brothers in their cheer." Hoder, trusting, lifted his arm. The courtyard echoed with laughter as another weapon flew, but this one sang differently. It cut the air like truth. The mistletoe struck Baldur's chest and sank deep, and for the first time, he bled. The laughter died. Baldur's glow flickered, his knees buckled, and the courtyard filled with a silence louder than any war cry. He fell as though the world itself had been struck. The gods rushed to him, their hands frantic, their voices breaking. They could not believe what they saw. He was supposed to be untouchable, the one light no shadow could dim. Yet there he lay, his body cooling like any mortal's, eyes fading into a place no one could follow. Frigg's wail split the sky, sharper than lightning. She had begged all things to spare her son, yet a forgotten sprig had undone everything. Odin stood rooted, grief and rage burning through him like fire through dry grass. He saw more than a son lost. He saw the first domino fall, the first note of the dirge that would end them all. He knew this death was not just tragedy, it was signal. The threads the Norns had woven tightened around his throat. The gods turned their eyes on Loki, suspicion thick as storm clouds. But Loki was gone, vanished into the folds of shadow, leaving only the echo of his laughter behind. The hall of the gods, once filled with merriment, now sagged beneath the weight of dread. They had thought themselves eternal. Now they knew the truth. Even light could be extinguished. And far below, in the realm of hell, the dead stirred. A ripple passed through the shadows as if the underworld itself leaned forward. The goddess Hel lifted her gaze, her lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. A new guest was on his way, one more luminous than all the rest, and his presence would tilt the balance of everything to come. They did not lower him into earth. They swaddled Balder in linen bright as hoarfrost, and laid him on a bier that smelled of pine and clean snow, and the silence around him felt like a room after laughter leaves. Frigg stood with her hands empty as if she had lost the habit of holding anything. Odin stood with his jaw set as if biting down on the future could slow it. No one asked what came next. The question had already been answered. Hermod stepped forward. He wasn't the loudest or the strongest. He was the one who could ride where roads refused to go. He touched the shroud once, a gesture small enough not to break, and said, "I'll fetch him." Odin did not waste blessings. He brought Sleipnir out, 8 legs restless, eyes like stormlight caught in ice. "Ride," Odin said. "Do not eat. Do not bargain your name. Tell Hel the balance has cracked and that we will pay what law allows." The stallion took the hidden paths the way a hawk takes thermals, by trusting the updraft you can't see. Air thinned, then turned heavy as wet wool. Roots arched across the dark like the ribs of a sleeping beast. Somewhere water dripped with the patience of centuries. At the border river, black as a closed eye. Sleipnir gathered himself and wrote 8 clean hoofbeats across the mirror. They landed on a shore that kept other people's footprints like secrets. The gate to Hel's Hall was tall enough to make pride feel small. Hermod knocked. Courtesy is armour when iron fails. The knock came back to him 3 times, softer each time, as if the hall were asking him to mean it. The door swung in by itself, inside. The dead moved like weather, slow, inevitable, touching everyone without belonging to anyone. On the far seat. Hel waited, one half of her face warm as bread, the other still as an unlit room. "I came for my brother," he said. "Balder." He came for himself. Hel answered. Threads arrive because they must, then set a price. Hermod said, "Too fast, then steadier, or take me instead." "There is a price," she said, rising, and even the dead listened. "If the world above loves him without remainder, if everything that breathes or roots or drinks the sky weeps, then I will release him, not for the grief of gods, but for the consent of all living." Hermod swallowed the shape of hope. "All things," he said, "every one. The world will tell you what it chooses." She made a small gesture, and Balder came forward in a light that felt like early morning before anyone speaks. He wasn't injured. He was finished with being harmed. "Tell Mother not to drown in what-ifs," Balder said. "Tell Father I know what he's planning and I love him anyway. Tell them I can wait." His hand on Hermod's shoulder warmed all the way through the mail. Hermod bowed and turned while he still could. Sleipnir took the river backward, past roots that remembered older storms, up into air that remembered lungs. The world opened like a door that had stuck but finally gave. He told them everything. He spared nothing. Not even the part where he had tried to sell his own future cheap. Frigg's hope rose like heat. She did not convene councils. She left footprints. The gods and their messengers followed, crossing fields and coasts, carrying the same sentence to every threshold: weep for Balder. The hills misted. Rivers swelled. Frost flowered and fell from fence rails. Wolves lifted their muzzles and sang lines the wind already knew. Horses lowered their heads and stamped in place as if agreeing. Trees wept in sap. Iron sweated salt. Even the old stones dampened like brows. News rides nerves faster than ships. Grief ran ridge to ridge until children cried because grown-ups were brave enough to. And grown-ups cried because the children didn't flinch. Not everyone agrees on what tears mean, but everyone knows when a sky lowers itself and becomes heavier to lift. Hermod kept tally the only way that matters, by listening for refusal and hearing none. "Yes," said the birch with its white wrist. "Yes," said the plough blade with its blunt, honest shine. "Yes," said the sea that had felt a great body turn in sleep beneath it. "Yes," said the hawk who prefers height to companions. "Yes," said the brown mouse living like a heartbeat under the floor. Belief began to ride beside him, matching Sleipnir stride for stride. They found a door standing alone in a field, the kind of place a story points at when it wants to see what you'll do. A woman stood there in colours that don't catch grey and work brown, and held a broom like a line she wouldn't cross. Her eyes had the colour of unlit mornings. "Will you weep for Balder?" Hermod asked. "I have no use for the bright ones," she said. "They make noise and teach wanting. The world will be quieter." "It must be all living things," he said. "One dry eye holds a gate shut, then let it be shut." She swept once across her threshold and went inside. The door sighed closed like a tired promise. Hermod didn't curse. He put his forehead to Sleipnir's neck and borrowed the horse's balance. The world had chosen not unanimously, but decisively. One thin thread can snag a whole cloth. That's how weaving works. That's how law works. He rode back the long way, through places where tears had already dried on fences, where someone left a heel of bread on a sill for whatever comes hungry, where fire remembered how to be kind. He told them Hell's term had failed because one voice withheld itself. Some clenched their teeth, some nodded as if confirmation hurts less than suspense. At the border again, he knocked. The sound returned 3 times, heavier each pass, until it leaned against his chest. Hell met him without triumph. "I felt the quiet return," she said. "The ledger closes. Tell me he is at peace," Hermod said. And his voice held until after the last word. "He is," she said. "Peace is not the thing you thought." She let him see Balder once more. The light in that hall straightened itself the way lights do when people stand up inside them. Balder pressed his brother's hand. "Carry the news gently. Don't let them make a weapon of it. Grief builds houses when you use it for wood, not for hammers." Hermod rode for home. At the place where air remembers lungs, he slowed. The world had not stopped. It never does. Fires needed feeding. Children needed stories that end in endurance, not despair. Warriors needed something to sharpen besides anger. He led Sleipnir into the courtyard. Odin met him with eyes that had aged a decade since morning. No one asked the question. Hermod spoke the truth plain. When he finished, something passed through the hall that wasn't wind. It was the sound a loom makes when it accepts a knot, the beginning of a pattern that won't favour you, but will at least be honest. Frigg turned her face and let the tears find her. Odin closed his hand on emptiness, and for a heartbeat it looked like a sceptre. Then it was only a fist. Somewhere past the horizon, winter took a long, deliberate step forward, and no one mistook it for anything else now. The seasons had lost their balance. Where summer should have stretched like a cat in the sun, the air stayed brittle. Frost curled around doors in midsummer, and the rivers wore skins of ice that never cracked. No one spoke the name for it aloud at first, as if silence could soften it. But the truth pressed harder each day Fimbulwinter had begun. It was a cold that didn't rotate with reason. It didn't visit and leave. It settled in like an unwelcome relative, taking the best chair and refusing to move. In Midgard, families counted food and found the numbers cruel. Bread thinned until it was memory, and broth became nothing more than hot water with hope in it. Fathers cut wood until their hands split, yet the hearths burned too fast. Mothers folded their children into cloaks and whispered stories about warmth as if words could thicken cloth. Wolves came closer to villages, lean as hunger itself, and men raised spears that felt lighter in their arms each week. Even the strongest warriors began to wonder if the greatest fight they'd ever face was not with giants, but with the slow gnaw of cold. In Asgard, the gods watched the horizon shrink. Fires burned in their halls, but even divine flame trembled. Odin called the council, his voice carrying weight enough to still every restless hand. "The long night has come," he said, and no one argued. Thor slammed his fist on the table, sparks leaping from the blow, and shouted that they should march to Jotunheim now, before the giants gathered their strength. But Odin only shook his head. He had seen enough in the well to know the storm would not be rushed. The fight would come when the threads demanded, not a heartbeat sooner. The days refused to separate. Morning and evening bled together until the sky was nothing more than a grey lid clamped over the world. Farmers stared at their fields, black and dead, and felt like trespassers in their own land. Children asked why the sun was hiding, and parents lied with smiles they couldn't quite hold. In the silence between their words, the howls carried closer each night, dragging along the promise that the sky itself would soon be bitten. Then the roosters began. One crowed in Asgard, its voice bright and golden, echoing off marble walls. Another cried in Jotunheim, low and iron-throated, the sound of mountains breaking. The last raised its pale voice in hell, thin but sharp, slicing through the endless dark. 3 cries in 3 realms, answering one another like signals across a battlefield. Every creature that heard them felt the marrow in their bones tighten. The message was simple. Time had tipped. Heimdall stood at the edge of Bifrost. The rainbow bridge dimmed to muted shades, his senses tuned to the tremor beneath. He had always heard more than others' footsteps on distant shores, whispers carried by ice, the heartbeat of a horse galloping in a dream, but now the sound that reached him was different. It wasn't one thing, it was everything. The rush of feet from hell's halls, the creak of a ship built from nails and sorrow, the snarl of wolves pulling at their leashes. His hand closed on the horn at his side, Gjallarhorn, its curve cold as fate itself. He lifted it slowly, breath tight in his chest. The gods turned toward him, knowing what the sound meant but unwilling to name it. Heimdall's lips touched the rim, and when he blew, the blast shook every corner of the 9 realms. It wasn't just sound, it was a call that bent trees, rattled bones, and told every soul that hiding was over. The battle was coming. The ground itself seemed to flinch. Odin straightened where he stood, spear in hand, his ravens circling above as if eager to carry the news further. Thor's grip tightened around Mjolnir, sparks snapping like war drums. Freyr felt the absence of his sword and knew already the cost it would demand. Even Loki, chained and writhing in his prison, heard the call and laughed in a voice that cracked the stone around him. The blast faded, but its echo lodged deep in every heart. Across Midgard, mortals lifted their heads and knew the stories were true. Across Jotunheim, giants grinned with teeth like cliffs. Across Hell, the dead stood in ranks, silent but ready. The sky hung low, heavy as a blade about to fall, and in the pause after the horn, a single truth pressed on all who could feel it. The first step of the last march had begun. The plain of Vigrid stretched wider than imagination, a battlefield older than time itself, waiting like a stage that had never forgotten its script. The frost bit deeper there, as if the ground already knew it would drink more blood than rain. When Heimdall's horn still hung in the air, shadows broke their chains. Fenrir surged forward, each pawprint sinking into earth like craters, his jaws yawning so wide they scraped the sky. His breath was smoke and rot, and the sound of his growl rolled through every valley like thunder grinding bone. From the sea, Jormungandr rose, the coils of his body lifting waves higher than mountains. Venom dripped from his fangs, turning the water black, and the ocean itself seemed to stagger under his weight. On his back rode the storm, lightning flaring green against the dark, as if the serpent carried the sky as his crown. In Hel's domain, the ship Naglfar cut loose from its moorings, sails stitched from sorrow, its hull built of fingernails gathered from countless dead. Loki stood at the prow, his chains finally broken, his eyes a mirror of the fire he carried inside. Behind him marched Hel's legions, a tide of pale faces with empty mouths, silent but more terrifying than any scream. The Aesir armed themselves in Asgard's golden courts. Odin's ravens circled low, whispering the tally of enemies that could not be counted. He mounted Sleipnir, 8 legs striking sparks, and lifted Gungnir, his spear, steady in hands that had already touched the truth of their own end. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. Today we do not fight for victory. We fight to be remembered. The warriors of Valhalla roared, the sound tearing through the air like a wall against despair. Thor's grip closed on Mjolnir. His eyes burned with a storm that no sky could hold. Yet behind the thunder there was a flicker of something quieter, the knowledge that his 9 steps would be his last. Freyr strapped on his armor, feeling the absence of the sword he had once traded for love. His jaw clenched, but he did not falter. Tyr, one hand strong enough for 2, called out to Garm, the hound that waited at Hel's gate, promising that their battle would be sung in ashes. The gods marched across Bifrost, the rainbow bridge groaning under their weight, colours dulling as if they too feared what was coming. At its edge, Heimdall stood ready, his eyes shining with every detail of the world. He and Loki locked gazes across the distance, neither smiling, neither looking away. They had always been opposites, the guardian and the trickster, the steadfast and the restless. Now they were bound to end one another, and both seemed to accept it with a silence that was almost respect. Vigrid filled with sound the trample of giants, the hiss of serpents, the clash of shields, the whisper of the dead. The ground shook so violently that Yggdrasil itself shivered, its branches groaning with the weight of the moment. Above, the sun dimmed, its light clawed at by wolves racing across the sky. The air was heavy, thick enough to choke, and still every creature on that field leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of an ending too long foretold. Odin raised his spear, and Sleipnir's hooves struck the ground like drums. The first line of Einarjar surged with him, their cries filling the emptiness that fear had left. The clash met in the centre of Vigrid with a sound so loud it felt like the earth itself cracked. Iron sang against iron, flesh tore, fire met ice, and the war that had haunted every dream finally began to breathe. In that chaos, every figure carried the weight of fate, Thor running headlong toward the sea serpent, Odin steering straight for the wolf, Loki steering Naglfar into the heart of the fray, and Heimdall bracing himself for the strike he had always known was coming. The battle had begun, and there was no song left to soften it, only the roar of the end itself. Odin rode straight into the storm of teeth and shadow. Fenrir's jaws opened so wide the upper reached the heavens and the lower scraped the earth. A darkness rimmed with flame and dripping foam. Sleipnir charged without falter, 8 hooves pounding the ground like a war drum older than creation. The air itself seemed to recoil, but Odin pressed forward, spear levelled at the wolf's chest. His eye, sharp as a blade, never wavered. He had known this moment since the day he gave his sight for knowledge, and now it had come to meet him. The wolf lunged, the ground splitting beneath the weight of his leap. Odin thrust Gungnir with all the fury of countless battles behind it. The spear struck true, burying itself in Fenrir's flesh, but destiny is not swayed by steel. Fenrir's jaws closed with the force of the sky collapsing, and the All-Father was swallowed whole. For an instant, the battlefield seemed to stagger. The ravens cried out in frantic circles above, and a silence spread like frost, as though the world itself paused to acknowledge what had been lost. Then the silence shattered. Vidar, son of Odin, surged forward with a fury that burned cold. He wore a shoe fashioned from the scraps of every leather ever offered to cobblers, a patchwork gift built over centuries, hardened into armour no fang could pierce. With one foot he pinned Fenrir's lower jaw against the earth, and with his hands he wrenched the wolf's maw wide. Vidar drove his blade deep into the beast's throat, cutting until the wolf howled blood into the sky. Fenrir's body buckled, collapsing under the weight of vengeance and prophecy fulfilled. Not far from where father and son clashed with destiny, the ocean boiled, and Thor waded into waves thick with venom. Jormungandr reared his colossal head, the sea serpent's eyes glowing like drowned suns. Thunder rolled in Thor's chest, louder than the storm above. He swung Mjolnir, each strike splitting the sky, lightning coursing down his arm and into the sea. The serpent struck back, its fangs dripping with poison so foul it turned the foam green. The clash was not a fight, it was nature itself breaking against itself, hammer against coil, storm against tide. Thor roared, bringing his hammer down on Jormungandr's skull with a blow that shook the sea to its roots. The serpent convulsed, its body thrashing with a violence that toppled ships and split cliffs. Black venom poured from its jaws, and the stench burned the air. Thor took 9 staggering steps back, chest heaving, his eyes locked on the beast writhing in death throes. He lifted Mjolnir one last time, but the venom already filled his lungs, thick and unrelenting. The god of thunder collapsed, the hammer slipping from his grip as the serpent's corpse coiled lifelessly in the tide. The sea fell still, but victory had tasted like poison. Elsewhere, Loki cut through the chaos, his laughter a blade sharper than any he carried. He met Heimdall at the bridge's edge, guardian against trickster, white fire against shadow. They circled each other with a silence carved by years of knowing this moment was inevitable. Heimdall's horn still echoed in the bones of the world, and Loki's chains still clung to his skin in memory. Their clash was swift, brutal, neither holding back, neither offering mercy. Blow met blow, wound met wound, until both staggered and struck the final cut at the same time. They fell together, their lifeblood mixing with the mud, their eyes locked even in death, as if neither could bear to look away. And still the field burned with more endings. Tyr wrestled with Garm, the monstrous hound of hell, their bodies tearing at one another with raw fury. Freya faced Surtur, the fire giant, his hands empty of the sword he had once given away. Flames wrapped around him, and though he stood unflinching, the blaze devoured him whole. Surtur lifted his burning blade high, and the horizon itself caught fire. Vigrid groaned under the weight of the fallen. The sky sagged low, torn by lightning and thick with ash. Wolves feasted on stars, serpents poisoned seas, giants shattered mountains, and the gods bled out on the soil they had sworn to protect. Yet through the ruin, one truth pulsed steady: they had not fled, had not hidden, had not begged. They had stood and fought, knowing the end was certain, and in that defiance lay the last dignity left to a dying world. Surtur raised his flaming sword, and for a moment it blazed brighter than the sun itself. Then he brought it down, cleaving the sky as if it were only canvas stretched too tight. Fire spilled out in torrents, swallowing mountain ridges, turning rivers into boiling veins, peeling forests to black skeletons. The world tree shuddered, its branches snapping under the weight of flame, its roots screaming as they split. Ash rained like snow, drifting through the battlefield, coating corpses of giants and gods alike in a pale shroud that mocked burial. The earth cracked and sank, seas roared inland, waves colliding with fire so violently that steam rose and blotted out the horizon. Lightning forked across the smoke, desperate to hold its place, but even the storm found itself consumed. The air was thick, molten. Breathing it was like swallowing blades. Men and monsters alike staggered, clawing at throats, eyes streaming tears that turned to steam before they could fall. Yet in that collapse, something strange stirred. A pair of human figures fragile, trembling huddled deep within the roots of Yggdrasil, Leaf and Lifthrasir. Their names were simple, their hands bare, their lungs ragged with ash. They were no warriors. They had no spears, no armour, no gods to call their names. All they had was each other and the shelter of the dying tree. When the fire raged too near, they clung tighter. When the ground quaked, they dug their fingers into the dirt and prayed not for mercy but for one more breath. They listened to the world tearing itself apart, and they did not scream. They whispered promises instead to plant again if soil remained, to drink again if water could still run clear, to bear children if wombs and cradles were not stolen by flame. Their voices were soft, nearly drowned by the roar of ruin, but the tree heard, even in death. Yggdrasil bent itself like a shield around them, as if the old ash knew its purpose was not to last forever, but to guard a seed, elsewhere, in the ashen dark. Baldur walked out of hell. His skin shone faintly, not with the blinding glow he once carried, but with a gentler radiance like dawn seen through fog. Hoda was with him, no longer blind, his steps unhesitant. Together they emerged into silence, their presence almost unbearable in its calm. Where their feet touched the scorched ground, the fire drew back a little, and the ash settled. It was not victory. They carried no weapons, wore no crowns. It was something quieter, the return of possibility. Baldur looked upon the ruins and did not weep. His gaze swept across the emptiness, the smouldering husks of halls and mountains, and what he saw was not only loss, but the shape of space left behind. Even gods can fall, he said, voice barely more than breath, but stories are harder to kill. Hoda nodded, as if that had always been the truth waiting behind his blindness. The sky dimmed, not with smoke this time, but with exhaustion. Stars blinked faintly, struggling to reclaim their places. The wolves who had swallowed sun and moon lay dead, their bellies burst, light trickling from their jaws like spilled honey. Slowly, light crawled back into the heavens, pale and weak but insistent. In the roots of the world, Lif and Lifthrasir stirred again, opening their eyes to the new sky. They breathed the air, tasting ash and something cleaner beneath it. They stepped out, small against the horizon, yet the only voices left alive. Their hearts beat fast, not with fear now, but with the wild courage of survival. The fire had not claimed everything. The story was not done, and in that moment, when ruin settled and silence became the new ground, the world tilted from ending toward beginning. The last battle was over, but a new word waited to be spoken, soft and steady, carried in the lungs of those who refused to die. The wind softened, not gone, not tamed, just quieter, as if it too needed to breathe after so much rage. Smoke lifted in threads, raveling the black veil over the sky. For the first time in what felt like centuries, light stretched across the ruins. It wasn't the fierce blaze of Surtur's fire or the harsh gleam of weapons. It was thinner, fragile, almost shy, but it was light all the same. The plain of Vigrid lay in silence, blanketed in ash. Mountains hunched like old men, scarred and broken. Rivers steamed where venom had spilled. The corpses of gods and monsters rested together, stripped of pride and purpose, their battles finished, their roars stilled. It should have felt like emptiness, but instead there was a pulse, faint but insistent, like a heart refusing to die. Leif and Lifthrasir stepped carefully from Yggdrasil's shadow. Their hands still clasped, their feet sank into the soft ash, leaving small prints where giants had fallen. They moved not with triumph but with reverence, whispering to each other as if afraid to disturb the silence. Their bodies were weak, their stomachs hollow, yet their eyes carried the stubborn glint of endurance. Each step was a refusal to vanish, to be forgotten, to let despair be the final word. Above them, the sun crept back into place, pale and tender as though relearning how to shine. The moon followed, its silver edge brushing aside what shadows remained. Stars blinked awake one by one, weary but loyal. The sky, though scarred, was a sky again. Time itself seemed to loosen its grip, no longer rushing to collapse but allowing the future to lean forward. In the distance, a sound stirred not the clash of war, but the quiet trickle of water. A stream ran fresh through cracked earth, threading its way among the dead. Leif knelt, cupped her hands, and drank. The taste was sharp, clean, startling in its simplicity. Lifthrasir drank after her, and together they laughed soft, unbelieving, as if laughter itself was proof that the world could return. Balder and Hoder appeared like figures in a half-remembered dream, walking side by side across the scorched field. Balder's glow, muted now, carried the warmth of dawn instead of the blinding blaze of noon. Hoder's gaze was clear, his blindness gone, though his expression held the humility of one who had once stumbled in darkness. They did not raise banners or command armies. They simply walked, and with each step the ruin seemed less absolute. Balder paused beside the stream, watching the humans. His smile was faint but sure. "The gods have ended," he said, his voice low but carrying. "But the world has not. What grows now will not be ours to rule. It will be theirs to keep." Hodder nodded, the weight of agreement deep in his silence. For a moment, the air shifted, and those who could still sense such things felt it a balance restored, not through victory, but through survival. No crown sat on any head. No hall rose from the ash. Only people remained, and the quiet promise that life, fragile, fallible, enduring, was enough. The fire giant's sword lay extinguished, a blackened husk cooling in the dirt. The serpent's coils hardened into ridges of stone, shaping valleys that rivers would someday carve. Fenrir's body became a mountain, his ribs the frame for forests yet to come. Even destruction, given time, would be carved into creation. The world sighed, not in weariness but in relief. The ending had passed, and though scars ran deep across earth and sky, a beginning pressed up through the cracks, as unstoppable as roots reaching for light. The air carried a new weight, not the heaviness of smoke and blood, but something gentler like the first breath after a long fever breaks. Ash drifted down in slower flakes, no longer smothering, more like a blanket settling on the world's shoulders. Out of that hush came voices, not the shouts of warriors or the commands of kings, but the murmur of ordinary survival. Leif and Lifthrasir sat at the edge of the stream, their fingers trailing in the water, whispering about planting, about hunger, about whether seeds could still sleep under soil that had tasted fire. Their talk wasn't grand, but it was steady, the way stone outlasts storms. Balder stood nearby, watching the humans with an expression both solemn and relieved. He had died, he had returned, and in his absence the world had cracked. Now, in his presence, the cracks did not heal, but they no longer gaped. His radiance didn't blind, it warmed. When he turned to Hoder, his once blind brother, there was no resentment in his gaze, only acceptance. Hoder's eyes, now clear, met Baldur's with a kind of gratitude that words could never hold. Together they embodied something the gods had never quite managed in their rain forgiveness. The ruins of Asgard lay silent in the distance, its towers broken, its halls gutted. Yet even there, whispers stirred spirits of gods who might return in some far-off age. Forseti, son of Baldur, was said to linger in the shadow of the law, his voice still shaping judgments fairer than swords. Some whispered of Vidar and Vali, survivors of bloodlines broken, walking the horizon with quiet strength, waiting for the chance to rebuild. Whether they were flesh or memory hardly mattered. What mattered was the idea that not everything had been erased. The land itself began to shift, as though reshaping around its new caretakers. Fenrir's ribs rose into hills, green moss already clinging to the black rock. The carcass of Jormungandr hardened into ridges that would one day be mountains. Even Surtur's blade, cooled and blackened, lay buried in earth that would cradle new growth. What had destroyed would now give form. Out of venom, rivers would carve. Out of fire, fields would sprout. The world had never asked to remain the same. It only asked to keep moving. The people who would come after would tell stories of this time. They would say that when the sky cracked and the oceans boiled, two humans clung to life in the roots of a dying tree. They would say a god returned not with wrath but with gentleness, and another walked at his side without shame. They would not speak of victory, because there was none. They would not speak of conquest, because it had ended. They would speak of endurance, of a flame that did not burn out, of seeds that dared to try again. As twilight softened into dawn, the survivors stood together. The gods had fallen, their power scattered, their halls gone. But something larger than gods had survived the will to continue. It was not glorious, it was not loud, it was quiet, stubborn, ordinary. And it was enough. In that stillness, with ash settling and light stretching across new earth, Baldur said the words no prophecy had ever dared to promise. This is not an end. This is a beginning. And though the world carried scars it would never hide, it also carried the stubborn truth that even in the wake of ruin, life insists. The world's silence did not last. It never does. Out of the hush came sound not of war, but of life trying to find its footing again. The stream that had first trickled through the battlefield grew bolder, weaving its way through ash until its voice was strong enough to echo against the broken stones. Birds returned, ragged survivors that circled the ruins in uncertain patterns before daring to perch. Their wings carried no prophecy, only the stubborn rhythm of flight. Leif and Lifthrasir began to walk farther from the roots that had hidden them. Each step was an experiment. They searched the ground for anything green, and when they found only grey, they pressed seeds into the soil with their own hands. They whispered to the dirt as if coaxing an old friend out of hiding. Their hunger was real, their fear sharper than any blade. But so was their will. Every gesture planting, drinking, watching the sky was an act of rebellion against nothingness. Baldur watched them with quiet awe. For all the power the gods had once commanded, none of them had ever carried the world's weight with such simplicity. He knew now that divinity was not in fire or thunder, but in the courage to build after everything has fallen. He and Hoder walked the scarred land together, their presence soothing where it lingered, but they kept their distance from the humans. This was not theirs to claim anymore. It belonged to the ones who bled without glory, who survived without miracles. The sun lifted higher each day, no longer hiding behind wolves. Its light revealed the scars the world would never shed: charred fields, broken mountains, oceans that still stank of venom. Yet it also revealed beginnings, tiny shoots of green pushing through cracks in the rock, streams that gleamed silver instead of black, the outlines of hills forming where bodies of giants had fallen. Destruction had not erased the shape of the world, it had redrawn it. Whispers carried through the air that other gods might return. Vidar, who had avenged his father, still walked with unshakable steps, his silence now the voice of promise. Vali, fierce and unbent, strode beside him. Together they were shadows of what had been and guardians of what might be. Forseti, Baldur's son, was said to speak in the hush of water over stone, settling disputes with calm that felt more powerful than any sword. These were not the lords of a golden Asgard, but remnants, threads left behind to weave something quieter, something humbler, Night came slower now, and it was softer when it arrived. Stars blinked awake, fragile but faithful, and the moon rose pale and steady. No wolves hunted it anymore. It glided across the sky like a scar finely closed. Families that did not yet exist would someday point at that sky and tell their children of fire and frost, of gods who fell and men who endured, of how the world had nearly ended and begun again. At the edge of the stream, Lif turned to Lifthrasir and said, "This is enough. It has to be." Her voice carried not defeat, but the stubborn music of survival. He nodded, gripping her hand, and in that grip lay the promise of 1,000 futures, and somewhere, deep within the earth, Yggdrasil stirred again. Its roots, though blackened, still reached, its branches, though burned, still remembered the sky. The tree had survived not to hold the gods, but to shelter those who would come after. The story had shifted, but it had not stopped. The world, scarred and weary, leaned toward dawn, and dawn, patient as ever, leaned back. The rivers carved their way deeper into the ash, tracing new paths where old ones had vanished. Valleys collapsed into basins, and the sea crept in, reshaping the map the gods once swore was eternal. Out of the ruin, a new horizon rose, and with it came a question that hummed through every living thing who would carry the story forward. Now Balder stood at the edge of that question. He looked across a world unrecognizable, yet he did not see loss alone. He saw the stubborn outline of possibility. When he lifted his hand, the light that spilled from him was not the blinding brilliance of the past, but something more human. Like a lantern held against a long night, Hoda stayed at his side, the brother who had once ended him, now a shadow-turned companion. The two of them walked together without shame, the weight of their shared history worn as openly as scars. Vidar moved among the ruins too, a figure of few words, his silence heavier than thunder. His strength was not in speeches, but in the way he knelt to push aside broken stones so streams could flow free, in the way he stood where the wind was sharpest, unbending as a tree in the storm. Vali joined him, fierce-eyed, carrying the stubborn fury of youth that refused to let the world forget what had been stolen. Together they became anchors, not rulers, men of muscle and grit rather than crowns. Forseti's voice returned in whispers, not as a god descending, but as a principle rising. His judgments came in the hush of water-smoothing rock, in the pause between quarrel and reconciliation. Farmers, who knew nothing of Asgard's grandeur, felt him in their fields when disputes ended with a handshake instead of a blade. His law was not written in marble, but in dirt, in bread shared and promises kept. Even the land carried remnants of what had been. Where Fenrir had fallen, a valley of dark stone rose, jagged and wild, a reminder of jaws that had once tried to swallow the sky. Children would someday climb those cliffs, daring each other to lean out and roar, not knowing they echoed the wolf's hunger. Where Thor collapsed, thunder lingered. Storms rolled in from the sea with a rhythm that felt like his heartbeat, hammering against the shore. Fishermen swore the waves broke stronger there, as if the ocean itself remembered the serpent's thrashing. But it was not only memory that filled the days. Green shoots pressed upward through cracks in the stone. Birds nested in the hollows of charred trees. The air carried not the stench of venom or soot, but the sharp, sweet bite of pine. The world was learning to breathe again. Each breath was shallow, fragile, but each one carried further than the last. Leaf and Lifthrasir gathered what little grew. They planted where they could, their hands cracked and bleeding from work, but their eyes lit with hope each time a sprout answered. They spoke often of children yet to come, not with grandeur, but with simple longing. Their dreams were not of halls filled with gold, but of fields heavy with grain, of laughter echoing in homes built by calloused hands. They were not gods, yet they carried something. The gods had always overlooked the will to live for the sake of tomorrow, not for glory. The scars of Ragnarök would never fade. But in the cracks of those scars, life wrote its own reply. It did not deny the ruin. It grew from it, turning what was broken into soil. Balder, Hoda, Vidar, Vali, Forseti, and the two fragile humans stood not as saviours but as witnesses to this truth. The end had come, but it had not kept its promise. The world would go on not because it was strong, but because it refused not to. The air above the new world trembled with a quiet not born of fear, but of waiting. Every creature that survived felt it, the pause between breaths, the hush before words take root. The gods who remained walked that silence like exiles in their own land. Baldur's radiance lit paths no longer gilded with divine promise but softened by human need. He bent not to thrones but to seeds sprouting in ash, and when he touched them, the shoots rose straighter, braver, as if the earth itself leaned toward him. Huda walked beside him, his once blind gaze steady. The two brothers joined not by tragedy but by choice, teaching the world that even wounds can be welded into strength. Vidar moved like a wall where storms threatened, his great shoe stamping the soil as though it still carried the memory of Fenrir's jaws. Each step he took pressed a kind of justice into the ground. Unspoken, but unyielding, Valley burned with the energy of beginnings, fierce and young, already gathering tales around him like kindling. They were no longer gods of rule, they were guardians of resilience. Their power came not from command, but from presence, the kind that steadies a hand or strengthens a back when labour threatens to break it. Forseti's voice flowed through the land in the form of settlements, learning to argue without blood. His law took root where hands clasped instead of clashed. It was a justice not written in iron tablets, but in daily bread, in shared fields, in the laughter of children unafraid to speak their minds. People felt his presence when grudges softened, when anger cooled into reason, when neighbours chose the long road of patience instead of the quick wound of revenge. And among it all, Leif and Lifthrasir laboured. They planted barley in soil still dark with soot, weaving baskets from the reeds that had somehow survived the flames. At night they sat by small fires, telling each other that the next day would be easier, even when their bones ached and their hands bled. They did not need prophecy to push them forward. They had hunger, and hunger was enough. Their children would someday hear the echo of gods in thunder and fire, but they would also know that their first ancestors were not crowned, were not chosen, they simply refused to give up. The ruins of Asgard loomed in the distance, jagged silhouettes that no longer inspired awe but caution. The halls lay gutted, golden stones dulled to grey, but they remained as markers, reminders of what happens when power forgets its limits. Baldur looked upon them with neither longing nor sorrow, only clarity. "Let them stand," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the barren fields, "not as homes, but as warnings. We do not need to rebuild what was broken. We need to grow what was neglected." The wind carried his words through the valleys, and the world seemed to shift with them, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with the steady movement of roots beneath the soil. The end of the gods had not erased life, it had cleared space for it to begin again. And in that beginning was a lesson sharper than any sword that glory fades. Crowns rust, halls fall into dust, but the act of enduring, of rebuilding from ash, is what holds the world together. In the quiet after fire, this truth became the new law of the earth. Survival was not the gift of gods. It was the will of those who stayed. The sky had grown gentle again, not in brilliance, but in tone. Clouds drifted without menace, their edges tinged with the soft gold of a sun relearning how to rise. Nights passed with a steady rhythm, stars returning like friends thought lost. For the first time since the horn had sounded, sleep no longer felt like surrender, it felt like restoration. The people who would one day inherit this new age gathered slowly, drawn by instinct more than plan. From scattered corners they came, carrying scraps of memory, fragments of tools, stories half remembered from their ancestors. They met in clearings blackened by fire, in hollows carved where mountains had collapsed, and though none called themselves leaders, they listened to each other. There were arguments, sharp as flint, but there were also compromises, the kind that survive longer than conquest. Baldur stood apart from them, not as ruler, not even as guide, but as witness. He understood now that the Age of Gods had never been about crowns or thrones, it had been about the people who believed in them. Without those voices, even gods were only echoes. He smiled faintly when he heard laughter crackle through the settlement like fire catching kindling. It was small, fragile, but it was music. Hoda lingered at his side, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. "They will not remember us as we were," he said. They will remember what we became when everything else fell away. Balder nodded. To be remembered not for power but for endurance that was enough. Vidar and Vali walked the fields, their strength no longer measured in war but in labour. They cleared stones from soil, built shelters from the bones of fallen beasts, and their silence was no less sacred than prayers once spoken in temples. For Seti's presence was felt in the quiet way disputes softened, in the long patience of people learning to live together. Justice had been stripped of grandeur and found its home in the ordinary. And through it all, Leif and Lifthrasir remained the heart. Their children's voices rose like a new chorus, carrying into the ruins and through the forests. The rhythm of their days, sowing, reaping, telling stories around flames was humble, yet it was this rhythm that held the promise of tomorrow. They did not speak of Ragnarök as doom. They spoke of it as the fire that cleared the field, as the night that made dawn visible. The ruins of Asgard still loomed, their shattered arches cutting strange shapes against the horizon. They were not rebuilt, and no one wished them to be. Instead, they stood as monuments to an age both glorious and flawed. People passed by them in silence, some with awe, others with unease, but all with respect. They knew the halls were gone, but the lessons remained: no power stands forever, no throne outlasts the earth, no crown resists the patience of time. As evening fell, the sky burned soft with colours that had nothing to do with fire. Balder lifted his gaze and spoke once more, his words a benediction for a world that had suffered enough. The gods are gone, but life endures. The end was written, but the story continues. Let that be our gift, and let it be your strength. The people listened, though some did not fully understand. They only knew that hope was not a luxury anymore, it was survival. They turned back to their work, to their families, to the fragile, stubborn act of living. And so the Age of Gods closed, not with thunder, but with the steady hum of human hands shaping the earth. The fire had passed, the ash had settled, and from it grew something quieter, but stronger. A beginning, born of an ending, carried forward by those who refused to let the world stay silent. The years that followed did not rush. Time walked slowly, as if testing the ground before it dared to run again. Grass covered the plains where battles once burned, green thread stitching shut the wounds of the earth. Rivers carried away the ash, their waters clearing with each season until fish returned, flashing silver beneath the surface. Birds stitched the sky with their flight, and the air learned how to carry song again. The scars of Ragnarök remained, jagged and black, but even scars can become landmarks when the living decide to build around them. In the settlements that rose from nothing, firelight glowed against walls of stone and timber. People carved homes into the sides of cliffs, planted crops where giants had fallen, and raised children who knew hunger but also laughter. The sound of hammers and weaving looms filled the days, not as symbols of power but as steady proof that life had chosen to continue. They told stories at night, some of what had been lost, some of what they dreamed would come, and in those stories the gods were not forgotten, but neither were they worshipped as before. They were reminders, not rulers. Balder walked among them, not as a deity demanding reverence, but as a quiet presence. His voice carried calm into troubled hearts, the way dawn softens the edge of night. Hoda remained close, his sight clear now, but his silence a reminder that even in new beginnings, grief still walked beside hope. They were not leaders in the old sense. They were symbols of what could rise after ruin. Vidar's strength became legend not in war but in labour. He could lift stones no one else could move, raise beams that made halls sturdy against storms. Children whispered his name when they carried burdens too heavy, and somehow their arms steadied. Vali carried fire in his spirit, fierce and protective, urging the people to never forget the cost of arrogance. For Seti's justice settled disputes that might have torn fragile villages apart, his wisdom flowing like streams, smoothing rough edges into something livable. But the true heart of the age belonged to Lif and Lifthrasir and their descendants. Their children grew, their voices carrying through valleys once drowned in screams. They built not temples, but hearths. They carved not thrones, but tables long enough to gather neighbours together. To them, survival was not a myth, it was a daily craft, shaped by hands blistered with work. In their laughter, the new world found its rhythm. And yet, Even as dawns brightened and fields ripened, memories lingered like shadows stretched long at evening. When storms rumbled across the horizon, some still thought of Thor's last steps. When fire glowed too hot in the distance, they remembered Surtur's blade. When wolves howled deep in the forests, hearts tightened, recalling Fenrir's jaws. The past had not vanished. It lived in the edges of their fear, but also in the courage they found to keep walking forward anyway. One night, as stars sharpened against the sky, Balder spoke to the gathered people. His words were not prophecy, not law. They were a reminder. The end came, and we endured. Not because we were strong, but because we refused to stop. Remember this, the world does not promise safety. It promises only the chance to begin again. Take that chance, every day. The crowd sat in silence, firelight painting their faces. No one cheered, no one wept. They simply listened, and when dawn broke, they rose to work again. That was the legacy Ragnarök left behind, not fire, not glory, but the stubborn heartbeat of a world that knew how to start over. The seasons began to steady, though they carried a strangeness no one could mistake. Winters still bit hard, but they ended. Summers returned with warmth that felt almost like grace. The people marked time not by prophecies or omens anymore, but by harvests gathered and fires kept alive through cold nights. The rhythm of survival became their liturgy, and each family carried it like scripture written on calloused palms. Balder often wandered the rebuilt paths, his steps unhurried. Where once he had been a god of blinding light, now he was a lantern, softer but more enduring. He spoke with farmers about soil, with children about courage, with weary men and women about the worth of waking up again tomorrow. When he listened, it was as if the silence itself leaned in to hear. Hodder walked beside him, his eyes clear but shadowed with the memory of what had been lost. He never spoke often, but his presence was a lesson of its own, that guilt could be carried without becoming a chain, that regret could walk beside forgiveness without undoing it. Vidar's strength became a foundation. Entire villages stood because of the beams he raised. Walls he held steady until they could bear their own weight. People did not pray to him. They thanked him with work, songs, and laughter. Vali's fire, sharper and younger, pushed others not to grow complacent. He reminded them that arrogance had once doomed the world, and that vigilance mattered more than crowns. His voice, fierce and insistent, kept history alive so that its wounds would not be repeated. For Seti's law grew roots, deeper each year. Where once justice had been decided by war, now it was settled in circles of people who listened, argued, and found middle ground. His spirit lingered like a current beneath their choices, turning quarrels into compromises, keeping the fragile peace alive. His was not the roar of a god, but the quiet persistence of water-shaping stone, and at the heart of it all, Lif and Lifthras's children spread. Their blood carried forward the memory of hunger, the ache of nights where fire was scarce and death pressed close. That memory sharpened them. It taught them to value bread over gold, warmth over pride, kinship over conquest. Their descendants would not build temples of ivory or halls of arrogance. They built homes where stories were told, where songs rose with smoke from the hearth, but the scars of Ragnarök never faded completely. Sometimes, on still nights, the wind carried a low rumble like Thor's last breath, or the ground shivered faintly as if Fenrir's spirit stretched beneath it. People paused in their work, listening, reminded that the line between ruin and rebirth was always thinner than they wanted to believe. Fear lingered, but instead of breaking them, it shaped them. Fear became fuel, a quiet ember driving them to guard what little they had built. One evening, under a sky heavy with stars, Balder spoke again. His voice was not thunder, it was steady, measured, human. "We have seen the world end," he said, "and we have seen it begin. Do not mistake this for safety. Do not mistake this for permanence. But know this, every dawn you rise, every seed you plant, every kindness you give is stronger than fire, stronger than wolves, stronger than fate. The end could not silence us. Let that be your proof." The people did not answer with cheers. They nodded, quietly, some with tears in their eyes, others with a set of their jaw. They understood. The lesson of Ragnarök was not despair. It was continuity, the simple, defiant act of going on. And so they did. The sky stretched wide and clean, the kind of blue that feels almost new, as if the heavens themselves had been scrubbed after the firestorm. Fields rippled with grain that bent in the wind like 1,000 whispered prayers. Children chased one another between the furrows, their laughter carrying further than the memory of screams ever could. Yet beneath that brightness, shadows still stirred, not in the form of enemies, but as memories refusing to sleep. Balder walked those fields and felt both pride and unease. He saw the people thriving, their hands busy, their eyes lifted to tomorrow. But he also saw how fragile it all was, how thin the line between this calm and the chaos that had once devoured gods. He did not tell them to forget. He told them to remember carefully. Strength, he said, is not in denying what haunts you. It's in planting anyway. His words became seed as much as the barley did, carried into hearts that feared the frost might return. Hoda listened more than he spoke. He would stand at the edges of gatherings, watching the flicker of firelight on faces, and when asked for counsel, he gave few words but deep ones. Be wary of blindness, he would say. Not of the eyes, but of the spirit. The world ended because we did not see ourselves clearly. His quiet became as important as Balder's light. One reminded them of hope, the other of humility. Vidar and Vali carried their weight differently. Vidar worked like an oak tree, solid, unshakable, roots deep in the ground. His silence steadied villages that trembled in doubt. Vali, younger, restless, pushed always forward, warning that complacency was more dangerous than war. He stoked the fire in their chests, urging them to guard what they built as fiercely as their ancestors had fought on the field of Vigrid. Together, they formed balance, endurance, and vigilance, muscle and flame. Forseti's presence lingered in the way disputes dissolved before they turned to blood. His justice became habit. People sat in circles to settle quarrels, voices low, patience stretched but never broken. It was not dramatic, not sung in sagas, but it was survival. In the quiet settlement of law, the future took root, and still, at the centre of it all, Leif and Lifthrasir's descendants grew in number. Their homes dotted the valleys, smoke rising from hearths where bread baked and stories passed from tongue to tongue. The children learned of Fenrir and Thor, of Loki and Heimdall, not with fear, but as history sharp enough to shape them, soft enough not to bind them. Around those fires, the lesson was told again and again that even gods can fall, but people endure, yet the land itself did not let them forget. Storms still rolled heavy over the sea, their thunder echoing like a hammer striking unseen anvils. Flames sometimes leapt too high in the night, making old men glance toward the horizon with unease, remembering Surtur's sword. Wolves still howled in the deep woods, and mothers drew their children close, whispering not just of danger, but of the courage needed to meet it. These reminders were not curses, they were warnings, etched into the fabric of the new world so it would never grow careless. One night, as stars burned hard and clear, Balder spoke to a circle of farmers and warriors. The gods' reign is over, he said, but the meaning of what we lived through remains. Do not worship us. Do not build thrones. Carry us as memory, as warning, as light you can hold in your own hands. The end is never gone, it waits. But so does the beginning. Every day you rise, you choose which one to serve. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the sky, as if the night itself agreed. The people nodded, their faces set with the calm of those who had inherited scars and turned them into tools. They knew now that their greatest act of defiance was not in dying gloriously, but in living stubbornly. And so the world, though scarred, pressed forward, carrying both the weight of its ruin and the promise of its dawn. The night sky had grown honest again, clear, sharp, its stars no longer muffled by smoke or venom. The people gathered beneath it, their fires small but steady, and each flame seemed to push the darkness back a little further than the last. It was in those gatherings that the stories of Ragnarök began to take root, reshaped not as warnings of despair, but as lessons carved from the marrow of survival. Balder listened as children recited the tales their elders had passed down, of Odin's swallowed whole, of Thor's 9 staggering steps, of Fenrir's final howl. Yet what struck him most was not the grief in their voices, but the awe. They were not terrified by the stories, they were steadied by them. To them, Ragnarök was no longer prophecy, it was memory, a scar inherited but not feared. And like all scars, it reminded them that wounds can heal. Hodor added his voice at times, his words slow, careful, carrying the weight of one who knew how easily blindness, whether of the eyes or the heart, could end everything. Remember this, he told them. The world ended not just because monsters rose, but because we failed to see ourselves clearly. Do not repeat that blindness. See each other, even in your flaws, and you will stand longer than gods ever did. His quiet authority turned silence into agreement, the kind that didn't need applause. Vidar and Vali carried their lessons in muscle and fire. Vidar showed them how to endure the patience of lifting stone after stone, of holding against winds that would flatten others. Vali warned them to never grow soft, to sharpen their tools, their wills, their memories, so that arrogance would not rot the foundations they had built. Together, they taught through example, the steady rhythm of action that outlasts speeches. For Seti's wisdom wove into the fabric of their daily lives. Disputes were no longer settled with blades, but with circles of listening. People learned to pause, to weigh words as if they were stones before placing them. It was not glamorous, not sung in any great sagas, but it was the quiet work that turned survival into civilization. His justice, unseen but deeply felt, became the spine of their new world, and always at the centre. Leif and Lifthrasir's bloodline grew. Their children's laughter rang through valleys once scorched, their games weaving through fields where gods had fallen. Each generation carried less fear of the end and more love for the beginning. Their stories around the hearth did not end with despair, they ended with endurance, with bread on the table and hope folded into tomorrow. Yet reminders of Ragnarök still lingered. When lightning split the sky, people remembered Thor's final strike. When the ground trembled, they thought of Fenrir's leap. When fire leapt too high, they felt the echo of Surtur's blade. But instead of paralyzing them, these memories became warnings etched into bone and never forget. Never repeat, never take peace for granted. One evening, as dusk melted into night, Balder stood before them all. His voice carried not the grandeur of prophecy, but the weight of lived truth. The gods fell, and so will you one day, but that is not failure. That is the rhythm of all things. The end is not meant to silence us, it is meant to remind us to speak, to live, to build while we can. Do not waste the chance. The people bowed their heads, not in worship but in recognition. They understood now that immortality was not in gods or thrones, but in memory, in stories told beside firelight, in children who carried both scars and laughter into the dawn. And so, the legacy of Ragnarök became not an ending, but a compass pointing them forward, steady and unbroken, into a world that belonged, finally, to the living. The years rolled forward, carrying the world farther from fire yet never fully away from its shadow. Fields grew thick with harvest, villages swelled with voices, and the rivers sang louder than the silence that had once blanketed the earth. But even as life deepened its roots, the memory of Ragnarök remained like a scar visible, undeniable, a constant reminder that the world's balance rested on fragile shoulders. Balder often walked alone beneath the stars, his face lit not by pride but by thought. He knew that his return from hell had not been a gift without weight. He was a bridge between what had ended and what was struggling to begin. People looked to him with reverence, but he refused the shape of a king. The world cannot be ruled as it once was, he said to Hodor one evening, their silhouettes outlined by firelight. It can only be tended, like a field. Power destroys, care endures. Hodor, with the clarity of a man who had lived blindness, answered simply, "Then let us be caretakers." Vidar's silence became legend. When storms cracked across the horizon, he stood unmoved, a figure whose stillness taught courage. Children would gather behind him, mimicking his stance, pretending they too could face down thunder. Valley burned brighter with every year, his voice fierce, his warnings sharp. He reminded them that arrogance had once poisoned even gods, and if they forgot that, the cycle could begin again. His passion was not bitterness, it was fuel, keeping their vigilance alive. For Seti's quiet law spread beyond settlements, weaving them together. Traders carried more than goods. They carried fairness, agreements honoured across valleys and rivers. Disputes no longer ended in bloodlines torn apart, but in hands clasped. Compromises spoken into being. It was not perfect, but it was steady, and in that steadiness lay the possibility of peace greater than anything the gods had ever managed. Leif and Lifthrasir's descendants multiplied, their homes stretching into valleys once blackened by ash. They built hearths and halls, not of gold but of stone and timber, their strength measured not by wealth but by endurance. Children's laughter rose above the ruins, weaving new sagas that began not with war but with resilience. Their stories honoured the fallen gods, yes, but they honoured survival more. The land itself seemed to heal in rhythm with them. Where Fenrir had fallen, wild forests grew, thick and dark but teeming with life. Where Thor had taken his last 9 steps, storms gathered often, but instead of dread, people welcomed them as blessings for their crops. Even the scar where Surtur's fire had split the horizon became fertile ground, black earth rich with promise. The destruction had not vanished, but it had been rewritten into the soil of the new age. One evening, when the stars shone harder than the moon, Balder gathered the people. His words were soft, but they carried the weight of endings and beginnings alike. The story of Ragnarök is not just about loss, he said. It is about what stands after. You are not the children of gods, you are the children of survival. That is greater than any throne. Carry it well. The fire crackled, sparks rising like prayers into the sky. People listened in silence, some with tears, others with quiet pride. They understood that their strength was no longer borrowed from gods, it was their own. And so the world turned, scarred but stubborn, carrying forward not the grandeur of Asgard but the humble, enduring truth that life, even at its weakest, is stronger than endings. Seasons folded into one another, carrying the world farther from the night of fire but never beyond its reach. The fields flourished, the rivers swelled, and the people's laughter rose like music over land once soaked in ash. Yet even in this renewal, shadows lingered not as threats with claws and fangs, but as questions etched into every heart. Could what was broken stay whole? Could those who had inherited a world reborn resist the arrogance that once dragged gods to ruin? Balder felt those questions pressing on him as he stood before the gathering one twilight. The firelight glowed against his calm face, his voice gentle but steady. We remember Ragnarök not because it destroyed us, he said, but because it failed to. The end did not silence life. It reminded us that living is louder than endings. His words settled into the people like seeds, quiet but fertile. Hoda stood beside him, his clear eyes reflecting the flames. He added few words, but when he spoke, they struck deep. Never look away from each other. That blindness cost us more than Fenrir ever could. The silence that followed was not empty, it was agreement. Vidar carried his lessons without speech. He moved through villages like a living wall, lifting beams, steadying roofs, planting alongside farmers. His presence was reassurance that even the strongest could serve quietly. Valley, fierce and unrelenting, challenged the people with reminders of fragility. Do not mistake peace for permanence, he warned. The moment you forget the weight of Ragnarök, you invite it back. His words sometimes stung, but stings keep wounds from festering. Together, the brothers balanced patience with vigilance. Forseti's influence deepened. Councils grew in every settlement, voices joining around fires, not to command but to compromise. Trade routes stretched farther, tied together not only by goods but by trust. The people discovered that law did not need thunder to be strong, it needed consistency, a thread binding them tighter than any weapon ever had. Forseti's justice lived not in temples, but in the ordinary rhythm of fairness, and through it all, the descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir multiplied. Their lives were not sagas of conquest, but of cultivation. They grew food from scorched earth, carved homes where gods had fallen, and raised children who carried both the memory of loss and the joy of survival. These were not heroes in armor, they were heroes with dirt under their nails, their courage measured in persistence. The land itself spoke through its scars. Forests rose from Fenrir's bones. Storms echoed Thor's hammer. Rivers traced the serpent's coils. The world remembered, and by remembering, it stayed alive. Each storm, each howl in the distance, each fire that leapt too high was a warning: respect the balance, or risk breaking it again. One night, as stars burned cold and countless, Balder spoke once more. His voice was softer than the wind, but no ear failed to hear it. The gods have ended, but the story has not. It is yours now. Guard it, shape it, carry it further than we ever could. Do not wait for fate to write it for you. Write it yourselves. The people sat in silence, firelight flickering on their faces. They knew now that their future was not a gift, it was a task, and with steady hearts, they accepted it. Thus the age that rose from Ragnarök was not crowned with glory, but with responsibility, and that responsibility, heavier than any throne, became the true inheritance of the living. The night stretched wide and endless, stars sharp enough to cut, and in that silence the people felt the weight of what they carried. They were no longer children huddled in fear of gods and monsters. They were the inheritors of a scarred but breathing world, and every dawn demanded they prove themselves worthy of it. Balder's voice became a thread that wove through their lives. He no longer needed to speak often. His presence itself was a kind of scripture. When he did speak, his words were carved with the patience of stone. Do not mistake survival for an ending. Survival is only the first act. What you build now will decide whether the world was reborn or merely delayed in its ruin. His words lit not fire, but resolve. Hodder, ever the quiet counterpoint, would add, do not blind yourselves with comfort. Remember how blindness once unmade us. The people nodded, some uneasy, but they carried those words back to their fields and fires. Vidar's strength became legend, told not in battles but in foundations. Walls stood because of him. Fields thrived because he tilled alongside those who had nothing but hands. His silence became a promise that the world could endure as long as shoulders bore weight without complaint. Valley remained the ember that burned hot, warning them against arrogance. He demanded vigilance, that their children know not only joy but caution. His voice was not always welcome, but it was always heeded, because no one could forget what complacency had once cost. Forseti's influence grew until councils met not just to end quarrels but to shape futures. They planned roads, divided labour, and weighed fairness like currency. It was a justice not gilded in temples, but practical, ordinary, living in the way a loaf of bread was divided so that no child went hungry while another feasted. In that fairness, people felt safer than they ever had under golden halls. The children of Lif and Lifthrasir multiplied, and their voices became the music of the new age. They carried baskets of grain where battlefields once burned. They carved runes on stones, not to summon gods, but to mark the places where survival had begun. Their stories shifted too. When they spoke of Fenrir, they no longer trembled. They told of the forests that grew from his body. When they spoke of Thor, they pointed to storms that watered their crops. They did not bury the past, they planted it, turning ruin into root. Yet the land kept whispering. Wolves still howled in the deep woods. Storms cracked against the mountains. Fire leapt too fast on dry nights. Each echo was a reminder endings are never gone, only waiting. But instead of fear, these echoes bred respect. The people had learned. They watched the horizon with caution, but they did not cower. They built. They planted. They sang. Balder stood among them one evening as the fires dimmed. His voice was softer than the crackle of embers, yet every ear caught it. We thought Ragnarök was the end, he said. But look around you. It was the clearing of the field. You are the planting. Remember, this endings do not belong to fate. They belong to those who decide what grows after. The crowd held their silence, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. They understood now that their inheritance was not the power of gods, but the responsibility of memory. And in that responsibility lay something stronger than any throne continuity. The stars overhead did not judge, did not promise. They simply burned, cold and endless, as they always had. But beneath them, the world stirred with new life, proving in every breath that Ragnarök had not claimed victory. It had only yielded the stage to those who refused to stop. The dawn that followed was quieter than any the people had known, not because the world lacked sound, but because it carried a weight that pressed gently on every heart. Fields shimmered with dew, and the first shoots of barley stood tall enough to promise bread. Smoke curled from hearths where families gathered, and laughter rose, though it always carried an undercurrent of memory, an unspoken reminder that all of this stood on ground once soaked in fire and blood. Balder walked among them. His glow softened into something that no longer separated him from mortals. He was not above them, not untouchable. He was part of their rhythm now. His words were not decrees, but questions. "What do you want this world to become?" he asked, leaning close to farmers, to children, to widows who had buried too much. Their answers varied: safety, harvest, peace, love, but the act of answering was the point. The new world did not belong to a single will. It belonged to many voices braided together. Hoder remained at his side, though he never chased light the way Balder did. His silence steadied people who felt the tremors of doubt. When quarrels grew heated, he would only say, "Do not blind yourselves." And somehow the words cooled tempers faster than fire could rise. His presence reminded them that truth was not always found in brilliance. Sometimes it was in restraint. Vidar bent his strength toward the building of bridges across rivers, halls large enough for many families, and walls that stood against winter's first bite. He had avenged his father, but now his vengeance was in permanent structures that would last beyond his lifetime. Vali, restless as ever, pushed them to think ahead, to prepare for storms even when skies were clear. The world ended once, he reminded them. Do not tempt it to end again. His fire kept them wary, and wariness was its own form of wisdom. For Seti's justice became tradition. Markets opened where once battlefields lay, and trade grew not from conquest but from agreement. Councils gathered to debate, not with swords at their sides but with patience in their voices. His unseen hand steadied every compromise, turning what could have been fractures into bonds. His law was not a weight, it was a spine. Lifanlithras's descendants were no longer few. Their children's children ran through valleys once scarred, their cries rising higher than the echoes of the wolves. These families carried the world on their shoulders not by choice, but by necessity, and they carried it well. Their stories became the first sagas of the new age, not of gods ruling from golden halls, but of people enduring, of planting where fire had scorched, of rising where ash had fallen. But the land kept its reminders. When thunder cracked, it sounded like Thor's hammer. When flames leapt too high, they whispered of Surtur's sword. When wolves howled in the far forests, people listened carefully, their spines stiff but unbroken. These were not fears anymore, they were boundaries, warnings written into nature itself. Respect them, and the world would last. Forget them, and ruin would return. One night, beneath a sky so clear it seemed made of glass, Balder spoke to the gathered crowd. His voice carried not prophecy but resolve. "We are not here because fate spared us," he said. "We are here because we refuse to stop. Let that be your faith, not that the gods will save you, but that you will save each other. That is the only power that endures." The fire burned low, and no one cheered. They simply sat in the glow, each of them knowing that the truth was heavier than celebration. They were not survivors of an ending, they were founders of a beginning. And in the quiet that followed, they understood that this was the greater story, not Ragnarök itself, but the will to rise from it. The world moved with a rhythm it hadn't known in ages, slower but steadier, like a heart learning to beat again after nearly stopping. Villages spread where ash had once choked the soil, and fields rose golden under skies no longer darkened by wolves. Yet in every field, every hall, there was a quiet reverence, as though the people knew they were walking on sacred ground earth that had tasted the fall of gods. Balder often lingered at the edges of these villages, his glow reflecting in the rivers that cut through new farmland. He did not lead councils or dictate law, he simply walked, and his presence steadied the weary. To some, he was proof that light could return after the deepest dark. To others, he was a reminder that even gods could be broken and still stand again. His voice, when he chose to use it, was less command than invitation. "What you build will outlive you," he told them. "Let it be something your children can lean on when the ground shakes again." Hoder remained quieter, his words fewer but sharp as chisels. He reminded them that blindness had nearly undone the world, and that to look away from each other, from truth, from responsibility, was to invite ruin back. When he spoke, even the most stubborn fell silent. There was no arrogance in him, only the weight of a lesson carved too deeply to be ignored. Vidar worked alongside the builders, his strength shaping halls where feasts and councils could be held. He lifted what no other could, but he did it without spectacle, as if service was his only answer to grief. Vali kept his fire alive, pressing the people not to forget, not to grow soft in peace. Ragnarök was not just a story, he told them. It was a warning. Do not make us repeat it. His fire sometimes felt harsh, but it kept vigilance alive like an ember smouldering in the hearth. Forseti's spirit was felt in the way people gathered. They settled disputes in circles, voices low, patience stretched but not broken. They found justice not in blood but in fairness, and each compromise was a stitch holding their fragile new world together. His influence was not dramatic, but it was lasting, the slow work of peace becoming habit. And always, the descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir multiplied. Their laughter filled valleys once hollow with death. Their hands carried seed and built walls. Their feet traced new roads across the scarred land. Their stories shifted too. They spoke of gods and monsters not with fear, but as history, a backdrop to their own courage. To them, Ragnarök was not an end but the soil of their beginning. Still, the land whispered, thunder rolled, and people thought of Thor's last battle. Flames leapt high, and they remembered Surtur's sword. Wolves howled, and every child turned to listen, reminded that endings always linger near. But instead of dread, these echoes became a compass. They pointed not to ruin, but to responsibility. One evening, and under a sky streaked with pale fire from the northern lights, Baldur stood before the gathered crowd. His face glowed not with the power of a god, but with the calm of a man who had walked through death and returned. The gods are gone, he said, but their mistakes need not bind you. Build not for glory, but for endurance. Choose not thrones, but tables. What will last is not the hall that shines the brightest, it is the hearth that never lets its fire die. The people did not shout or sing, they simply nodded, the quiet of their agreement stronger than any cheer. They knew then that their future was not carved by divine will, but by their own hands scarred, blistered, but steady. And so the new age pressed forward, not in triumph, but in resilience. The gods had ended, the people remained, and in their stubborn survival, the story found its true continuation. The years that followed pressed forward with the stubborn pace of roots digging through stone. The villages became towns, their halls built not of marble or gold, but of timber and sweat. Smoke rose each evening in plumes that marked life, not loss, curling into skies that had once been torn open by fire. The people thrived not in grandeur, but in endurance. Yet even in their growth, the memory of Ragnarök lingered like a scar beneath the skin, shaping every choice. Baldur often watched from the edge of gatherings, the glow of firelight catching in his calm features. He did not claim rule over them, nor did he seek worship. Instead, he reminded them with gentle words, strength is not in crowns or swords, it's in the patience to build what lasts beyond you. His presence was not thunder, it was steady flame. Hoda, beside him, spoke less often but with sharper weight. Blindness, he said one night, his voice low, is not the absence of sight. It is the refusal to see what stands before you. Never turn away from each other. His warning carried into the hush like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading wide. Vidar's legacy grew in the structures themselves. Children climbed beams he had lifted, ran across floors he had steadied. To them, he was not a god of vengeance, but the unshakable foundation of their homes. Vali's voice kept them vigilant, his fiery reminders threading through councils and work songs alike. The world ended once. Never believe it cannot end again. His fire was uncomfortable, sometimes resented, but always remembered. Forseti's justice became the spine of the settlements. People carried disputes to circles of neighbours, and fairness was shaped not in fear of punishment, but in the habit of listening. This habit became culture, and culture became law. The people found strength not in war but in compromise, their resilience knitted tighter with each season, and in the heart of it all, Lif and Lifthrasir's descendants flourished. Their families filled the valleys, their laughter carried across rivers, their hands sowed crops that grew higher each year. They honoured the past not with temples but with memory, weaving sagas that told not just of gods and monsters, but of people who endured when the world burned. To their children, survival itself became sacred, but reminders never slept. When storms cracked across the horizon, they still thought of Thor's 9 steps. When fires flared too bright, they remembered Surtur's sword. When wolves howled deep in the forests, mothers and fathers drew their children close, their eyes steady but wary. These were not fears, they were anchors, keeping memory alive so arrogance could not erase it. One night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, Balder spoke again. His voice carried no demand, only truth. The gods fell and still the world rose. That is the lesson. Do not live as if fate is fixed. Live as if each day is the start of your own creation, because it is. The people sat in silence, firelight painting their faces, their hands resting on the tools that had built their homes. They understood then that the saga of Ragnarök was not just about what ended. It was about the hands that refused to let the ending stand. And so, from ruin, they pressed forward, not with glory, but with the stubborn strength to begin again. The gods were gone, but life, scarred and steady, had claimed the final word. The new world did not arrive in a single sweep of light. It unfolded in layers, like dawn fighting its way through fog. Each season pressed forward, carving itself into the rhythm of ordinary lives. Fields turned rich and heavy with grain, forests thickened, rivers swelled clear and cold. Yet every breath of renewal carried the memory of fire and ash, as though the world itself whispered, "Remember what it cost to begin again." Balder's presence became less a miracle and more a constant, woven into the daily lives of the people. He did not hover above them, but walked among them, his light soft, his words practical. When disputes rose, he would remind them gently, "You are not enemies." The true enemy was always silence, always forgetting, and somehow his words cut through anger better than steel. Hodder, quieter, leaned on silence itself as a tool. His lessons were given in pauses, in watchful eyes that forced others to confront their own choices before he spoke a single word. Together, they became twin guides, one shining, one shadowed, both steady. Vidar's strength shaped not only homes but roads, bridges, and walls that bound the settlements together. His silence carried weight, teaching that work itself could be prayer. Vali's restless fire pressed against complacency, stirring hearts with warnings sharp as blades. "Peace is fragile," he said, "and fragility is no excuse to sleep. Keep watch." Though his words unsettled many, they kept vigilance alive. In him burned the ember of Ragnarök, not to destroy, but to keep memory sharp. For Seti's law spread wide. Councils grew into assemblies, gatherings where voices argued but ended in balance. Fairness became tradition, and tradition became culture. The people found strength not in kings but in the quiet discipline of listening. It was slower than war, but stronger than conquest. And at the centre of this age, the children of Lif and Lifthrasir thrived. They planted, built, and sang, their numbers swelling into generations who never saw Ragnarök but carried it in the marrow of their stories. Around hearths, they spoke of gods not as rulers but as ancestors flawed, fallen, yet remembered. Their sagas were not warnings alone, they were blueprints for endurance. But the earth never let them forget entirely. Wolves still howled in the distance, thunder still cracked with the echo of Thor, fire still leapt too high on dry nights. Each sign was a reminder that endings always linger, waiting for arrogance to invite them back. Yet the people did not cower. They acknowledged the shadows, and then they worked, planting seeds into the same soil that had once burned. One night, beneath an aurora that painted the sky with rivers of green fire, Balder spoke to the gathered families. His voice was soft, but every ear caught it. The story of Ragnarök was not the tale of gods. It was the tale of what came after. You are that story now. Carry it not with fear, but with courage. The end was not written to silence you. It was written to remind you that even endings can be beginnings. The people did not cheer. They simply nodded, their faces lit by fire and sky, their hands resting on the tools of survival. They knew that their strength was not measured in battles won, but in the stubborn will to build again and again. And so, the saga pressed forward, scarred, scarlet, but unbroken, its final truth carved into every heart. Endings are not the opposite of life. They are the soil from which it grows. Seasons turned into generations, and what had once been fragile settlements grew into thriving communities. Roofs of timber lined valleys once blackened, and smoke from hearths curled like a soft crown over the land. The memory of Ragnarök lingered in every story, but the people no longer trembled at its mention. They spoke of it the way farmers speak of a past storm, fearsome, yes, but survived. Balder walked among them still, his presence woven into their daily rhythm. He was not worshipped, but remembered. His glow softened to something like the light of dawn after rain. Children ran to him, asking questions about the old age of gods. He never lied, never polished the truth. We were powerful, he told them, but not wise enough to endure. Wisdom belongs to you, now don't waste it. Hodja, always the quieter shadow, added only, see each other. Do not blind yourselves. These words became more than lessons, they became warnings written into culture, a quiet law no one dared ignore. Vidar's name lived in the beams of halls and the arches of bridges. Vali's fire echoed in songs sung before hunts and harvests, a reminder to remain sharp even in peace. For Seti's justice stretched far. People crossed rivers and mountains to settle disputes in circles of fairness, his influence no less binding for being invisible. And through it all, the descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir multiplied, their hands carrying the world forward, their laughter softening the edges of memory. Yet the land itself still hummed with echoes. Thunderstorms reminded them of Thor. Wildfires hinted at Surtur's blade. Wolves howling in the forests made children press closer to their parents. These echoes were not curses, they were anchors, tying every new dawn to the truth of what had been lost and what had been gained. A new rhythm settled into the world, but no rhythm is without tension. Crops failed some years, and hunger pressed hard against doors. Quarrels sparked between villages over rivers, forests, and borders. For a moment, it felt as though the seeds of ruin might take root again. It was in these moments that Balder's voice carried like a bell across the dark. Do not repeat the blindness of the gods, he warned. Do not let pride destroy what fear and fire could not. His words cooled tempers like water thrown on flame. Hoda reminded them that endings were always closer than they believed. The world does not end with wolves or giants, he said. It ends when you stop caring for one another. His truth, carved from his own guilt, struck deeper than prophecy. People listened because they knew he had lived it. Vidar stepped in where strength was needed, helping rebuild after storms, lifting stones that broke others' backs. Vali's warnings grew sharper when greed threatened fragile bonds. Do not mistake abundance for safety, he said. Peace must be guarded as fiercely as war. His fire often stung, but it also kept their vigilance alive. For Seti's councils expanded, weaving justice into every new community. His law was not thunder, it was a steady river, and rivers, over time, shape entire landscapes. And the descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir carried everything forward. They planted, harvested, built, and told stories, their sagas shifting each generation but never forgetting the core truth life had endured. That truth alone was enough to keep them rising with each dawn. Generations later, the scars of Ragnarök had become landmarks. Children climbed hills that had once been Fenrir's bones, played in valleys carved by Jormungandra's coils, and gathered wood from forests that grew out of ash. To them, these were not ruins, but part of the world's shape, as natural as rivers and stars. Yet the memory of fire was never erased. It lived in their songs, their warnings, their prayers whispered before harvest and storms. Balder, still walking among them, felt the shift. He saw that the people no longer needed him, as they once had. They had grown into their own strength, not dependent on gods, but rooted in their own endurance. He smiled, not with sorrow, but with peace. You are no longer children of survival, he said. You are builders of tomorrow. Carry it well. Hoda echoed him with a softer truth. Do not let your eyes grow blind with comfort. Endings are always waiting, Vidar's legacy was carried in stone, Val's in fire, Forseti's in the habit of fairness. The bloodline of Lif and Lifthrasir filled the valleys and mountains, countless voices carrying forward the stubborn heartbeat of humanity. They were proof that the world could end, and end again, and still find its way back to dawn. And so, beneath a sky once torn apart by fire but now endless and calm, the story of Ragnarök became more than a tale of gods and monsters. It became the backbone of a people who had learned that the truest power is not in never falling, but in rising, scarred and unbroken, every time the world demands it. The world breathed easier, but the memory of fire never left its lungs. Villages grew into towns, towns into networks of trade, and the voices of people carried farther than the echo of gods ever had. Yet every story they told, every song sung by hearths and in fields, carried the shadow of Ragnarök, not as terror, but as anchor and eternal reminder that even the mightiest had fallen, and yet life had risen stubbornly from the ash. Balder moved through this world like a quiet witness. His glow no longer startled the young, it comforted them, like dawn promising another day. When asked if the gods would rise again, he answered with a small smile, "They already have through you." "Hoda, standing close," added his voice, steady and sharp. "Guard that gift. Do not let blindness return. The world ends not when fire comes, but when care disappears." His words carried through the crowd like a low thunder that lingered long after the sky had cleared. Vidar's name was etched into the stones of bridges and halls, his strength immortalized not in battles, but in the bones of the world the people built. Vali's fire lived on in their vigilance, warnings recited like prayers before each planting season and each journey beyond familiar borders. Forseti's justice became the fabric of their society, his spirit present in every council, where fairness triumphed over greed. Together, they were no longer gods, they were principles woven into the marrow of humanity. The descendants of Lif and Lifthrasir filled the valleys with life. Their children grew strong in fields fed by rivers that once boiled with venom, their laughter spilling into forests that had sprouted from scorched earth. They carried no crowns, wore no armor, but in their hands the world found its future. Their sagas were told not in bloodshed but in bread, not in conquest but in continuity. Still, the land whispered its warnings, storms rolled heavy, wolves howled in the distance, fires burned too hot on dry nights. But instead of fear, these reminders deepened respect. The people understood now that endings are always near, but beginnings are just as close. That tension was no curse, it was the balance that made life precious. One night, under a sky lit with northern lights rippling like rivers of green fire, Balder gathered the people. His voice was steady, carrying the final truth of everything they had endured. The saga of Ragnarök was not written to destroy you, it was written to remind you. What matters is not that gods fell, but that you rose. Carry this truth forward, endings will come, but life will always answer. As long as you begin again, the story never dies. The crowd did not cheer, did not shout. They stood in silence, the firelight catching their faces, the aurora painting the sky above them. In that stillness, they understood. They were not living in the shadow of an ending. They were walking into the endless promise of beginnings. And so the tale of Ragnarök closed, not with fire, not with silence, but with the steady heartbeat of a world that had learned how to endure.